And when he made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables, and said unto them that sold doves, Take these things hence, make not my father's house an house of merchandise.
Thank you very much, Jaden. All right, so we have a very well-known example of something that Jesus did. It almost seems out of character for Jesus when you think about how he usually handled people that disagreed with him, asking questions and telling parables and things like that. This time he just takes some cords, binds them together, and drives them out of the temple. So that's an alternative style of teaching, but it's one that we can learn a lot from, all right? What I want you to do this morning is I want you to imagine that you are a Jew living in the first century. And you know your history. 1,500 years prior to this, your people lived in the land of Egypt. And in Egypt, you were forced to make bricks every single day, day in and day out. No Saturdays, no MLK days, no teacher work days. You were forced to work every single day, and it all just sort of ran together. And then after a man named Moses leads you out of Egyptian captivity and through the wilderness for 40 years, you enter into a land that you've been told that was promised to your forefathers 400 years prior. And that this is your land. This is your God-given right to stay here, to live here. This is where your people will abide forever if you keep the covenant that I've given to you, is what God tells you. Well then, after, a generation or so, things get messed up, and a foreign people come into your land, and they start to oppress you and to enslave you and do the same sort of things to you as happened in Egypt. And so you have realized that you sinned, you repented, and you overcame it, and then you go through this process, every generation or so, until up to you. But one of the big things that happened in your history, you recall, and things really haven't been the same since, is a nation called Babylon carried you away into captivity 600 years prior to your birth, in 606 BC. And after 70 years of being in Babylonian captivity, having your temple destroyed, having your city and the walls of the city burned to the ground, and just plundered by a foreign entity, taking you out of the land that is your God-given right, that was promised to your forefathers, you're finally able to return to find everything in ruin. And you rebuild and you reconstruct the best that you can, but really nothing is ever the same again. You just get handed from nation to nation, from the Medes and the Persians to the Grecians, and now finally to the Romans. And now here you are. You are a Jew, and you're living in the first century, but you're not living in that land that was promised to your forefathers. Roman taxation has driven you away from the farm that your family has owned for generations, the land that was given to you as your birthright. You're driven away from it due to high taxation. You have to sell it in order just to get by to some individual who is in league with the Roman Empire. You've been oppressed. You're not even considered really human because you're not a Roman citizen. And so you have to travel all the way to Asia Minor, to Ephesus, in order to work just to provide for your family, just to get by so you don't starve. And so you pick up a trade, something that's not what you really wanted to do with your life. You don't get to go to the temple like you wanted to. You don't get to go 3 times a year. You don't get to travel to the promised land and see that old home place like you'd like, because you are forced to return basically to Egyptian captivity in a sense. Just the oppression from the government has sent you into this sort of financial crisis. And then finally, after years of working and saving and doing your best to make your way in the world, you're able to take your family to Jerusalem to worship for the Passover. And you know that when you get there, you want to do all sorts of things. You want to make offerings to God and things like that. But you don't have a flock, so you have to purchase it. And so when you get down to the marketplace in Jerusalem, you're looking for a place to purchase a lamb or maybe a bull or maybe even 2 doves if you can afford it to offer up to your God. Now keep in mind, the sacrificial system under the Old Covenant served a couple of different purposes. One of the purposes was to allow you to worship God in a prescribed manner that differentiated yourself from the foreign nations who offered up their children and who did all sorts of evil things. And so you are going to want to worship God, but it also served as a way to basically a taxation system to support the priesthood. And so the sacrifices were set up in kind of tax brackets. Those who were more wealthy, God said, you can offer up a bull. You can afford that. Those who were sort of in the medium range might offer up a lamb or a goat. And those who were the poorest of the poor, they could only afford to offer up maybe 2 doves. That's all they could afford to spare to worship God. And so everybody tells you, no, the things are not done out here anymore. To buy the sacrifices, you need to go into the temple. And so you go into the temple complex, and there's all these tables with booths set up, and there's money changers so that you can take your foreign currency and switch it up to be able to afford whatever this is here. It's kind of like when you go to the airport, I guess. Same sort of prices too, just to be honest. And when you start to count up your money, you realize this is ridiculous. I can't even afford the doves hardly. I mean, how am I supposed to worship God? But I have to, because if I don't, my sins aren't going to be forgiven. So I have to pay this ridiculous amount. But at the same time, can I really afford it? Can we even get back home since we're being charged so much for this? Do you see the predicament that you're in? The faith that you've been raised with has now joined forces with the government. The government's already oppressing you so much with high taxation, taking away your land basically, charging you ridiculous interest rates on loans, and now the faith that you know is abusing you just as much, charging you crazy prices, but it's prices that you have to pay, otherwise you're not going to get the forgiveness that you need from God. You see? This is the type of situation that Jesus walks in on at the Passover here in John chapter 2. In John chapter 2 and verse 13 we read this. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. And he made a scourge of cords and drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. He poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who were selling the doves, he said, "Take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a place of business." In another account of this taking place, you recall he says, "Don't make my Father's house into a den of thieves," is what he said. So what Jesus has done here is he has identified with his people. He sees their oppression. He sees what's going on, how things have become so corrupted, and he takes a stand. And he takes a stand, the intensity of the corruption, he has to respond to that with the same type of response, the same type of intense response. Kind words won't do anything here, so he has to take this extra measure to drive these people out of the temple. Now we look at this situation, and we say to ourselves, man, that's awful. That's awful that people would dare take advantage of others through religion, through their faith, because of their faith. How dare we will just call it the church or the religious institution, join forces with the government to oppress them more than they already are being oppressed. All right? Now I'm going to take a quick example that we can all agree with, and then we'll get to another example that might be a little bit tougher for us to receive. All right? So we're all familiar with stories of people who watch some televangelists, and they are told if you just send X amount of money, then you'll receive X amount of benefit or X amount of reward. And these are people who are already on their last dollar, and yet they think, well, this is what the preachers told me, and so what do? They send in the check, or they send in the money order, they send in a couple of dollars, expecting to receive reward. They are already having a hard enough time with taxes and expensive health care and how expensive gas is and how expensive groceries are and things like that, trying to support their family. And now they're trying to do what God wants them to do, and so they write that check in hopes of receiving tenfold, is the idea. Do you see how that's a similar situation that we have here in John chapter 2? They feel religiously obligated, as if it's a matter of their salvation, that they have to send in this check, even though it's their last 2 mites, as the little widow with the 2 mites did in Luke chapter 21. We'll get to that a little bit later. But here's example, or maybe the question for you that's going to hit us a little bit harder. What type of people do we vote for? What type of policies do we support? What type of luxuries do we allow for ourselves? But on the other end of that, you have people that are poor and in need and who don't have as much as we do and aren't blessed in the ways that we are. They're receiving, the bad end of the stick when we do those types of things. You see, if we as Christians, if we as the church get in cahoots with the Roman government as the synagogues and the temples were doing back then, how are we any better than they? We have to evaluate everything everything that we do. How do our actions go to hurt or to harm somebody else, you see? And that's a lot of things that we don't think about. But this is what Jesus had to bring to their attention here in John chapter 2. He says, you need to stop taking advantage of these people. They're already being taken advantage enough of, right? They've already had enough through the government. You don't need the church hitting them a second time. Now, let's bring up an example of this. Go in your Bible to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. 1 Corinthians chapter 16. And I'm going to give you an example of this from my own personal life. In 1 Corinthians 16, verse 1 and 2, we read this. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so do you also. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collections be made when I come. Now, the historical context of this is as follows. The Apostle Paul is traveling through on his missionary journeys, and he's teaching people the gospel, and he's building up the churches with the end goal of returning to Jerusalem by the time of the Passover to take a collection so that the needy saints there can be taken care of, right? And what he wants them to do is, whenever they come together on the first day of the week, to put together money and to, get it ready so that they can just give it to them and they don't have to, sort of fuss and get it all together at the very end, right? We've all been there, I'm sure, getting things together at the last second. So he doesn't want them to do that. He wants them to plan ahead. Well, when I read this verse as my 19-year-old self, college self, 19, 20-year-old self, when I read this verse, I read, if you don't give every first day of the week, you're not doing what God wants you to do, and so you're probably going to go to hell, most likely, is the way that I would have read that verse, 7 years ago. 7 years and, let's see, hang on, 7 years and 13 days ago. So I can do that because, now when somebody says, how old are you? I'm just not going to say 27. I'm going to say, I'm 27 in 13 days because that's how old my baby is. So, all right. So I read this passage this way. If I don't get the week, I'm not worshiping God like I should, so I'm probably going to go to hell, most likely. Well, when you are sitting there in the assembly and they're about to pass the plate around and you realize that you've got enough money for probably a bag of ramen noodles, maybe a Coke, perhaps, or those cheap slices of pizza that they get at the mall. You might be able to get a couple of those if you're lucky. What do you give? Well, y'all know me that I do magic tricks, right? That's what I like. That's one of my hobbies that I had growing up. And so I used to carry around a bunch of $2 bills, and I would transform people's $1 bills into a $2 bill. And, if they're young enough, they're like, is this even real? And then all the old people laugh at them, right? So that's what you do. And so I'm sitting there going, well, I have to give because if I don't give, I'm going to go to hell. So let's see. I guess I'll just give my $2 bills. And I put all my $2 bills in the collection plate. Do you see how faith was used in that situation? See, I didn't have hardly anything except for college kid money, right, from a part-time research assistant job, Do you see how faith in that instance was, sort of doing an injustice there? Do you see how that's sort of a similar situation as John chapter 2? If I would have said, I need to, I just need to save up money so I can give next week, maybe a double, and then use this money for the groceries that I need, do you think God would have been upset with me there? You see? Sometimes we can behave in a way without being overt like these people in John chapter 2 were doing, But we can end up with the same result of oppressing people, hurting people, basically forcing people to do something that they can't really afford to do in a situation like that. We all want to give. We all want to support the work of the church. We all want to do this. But do we see how sometimes an ox gets stuck in a ditch? How sometimes that, God's not going to, it's not going to be the end of the world if you can't afford groceries this week, so you better not put $10, $20 in the collections plate, maybe save it for next week. You see? This type of attitude that we've had in the church has produced the same type of effect that they had in John chapter 2. At least it can for certain people. And so when we talk about giving, we have to really put emphasis on this part in 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 2. Put aside and save as he may prosper. Well, if somebody's not prospering, is it the end of the world if they are not able to give every single week like we can, or like some of us can, right? You see, we just need to think about the Bible not as sort of law-like or legalistically as we have in the past, because that can do harm in the long run. Same thing is true with Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 25. Notice this. Hebrews 10:25 says this, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Now, I've quoted this passage to myself many times in the past, and the way that I've quoted this passage to myself is, if you do not go to church every single Sunday and every single Wednesday and every gospel meeting and every VBS and every church gathering that's possible, then you are forsaking the assembling, you are disobeying those who have rule over you, and so most likely you're going to go to hell, is the way that I read that to myself. Now, I read it to myself a different way now just because of the context of the passage, but let's just assume that that's the proper interpretation. So let's say that you have somebody that has to work to support their family, and their boss wants them to come in on Sunday, and it's come in on Sunday or lose their job. Now, thankfully, we here, nobody's afraid to go to work on Sunday here, but that is true in some places where they feel like they are, what choice do they have but to go to work on Sunday, and yet the whole time they're there, they feel guilty because they've been taught that they are forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. Do you see how our interpretations of the Bible and how strict we are sometimes with certain verses of the Bible can lead to a John chapter 2 situation when God may not have intended for us to use the verse that way, as we're going to see in a little bit. Another example of this is Laura right now. Laura's got the baby, and they told her, you kind of want to keep the baby away from all you sick folk until, like 3 to 6 weeks or so. And so, yesterday I asked Laura, I said, I told him, I was going to go to church, and jokingly I said, because I know she can't, I said, hey, you're going to go take the baby to Bible class tomorrow? And she said, well, no, we can't do it until 3 weeks, the doctor said. And I said, well, not forsaking our own assembling of ourselves together, as a matter of some is, And, she, obviously, she loves that joke. She thinks it's the best. She thinks it's hilarious, but that's a joking way to show how sometimes we have used general guidelines, employed them as strict rules, and then condemned people who can't help it, right? Let me go to one example of this. Go to the book of Luke, chapter 21. Luke chapter 21 and verse 1 and following. We're going to spin the widow's gift in a different way, and then we're going to return back to John chapter 2 for a cool little parallel. Luke chapter 21. Let's look at this. He looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw a poor widow putting in 2 small copper coins. Your version say mites. And he said, truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all of them, for they all out of their surplus put into the offering, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had to live on. And while some were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, he said, as for these things which you are looking at, the day will come in which there will not be left one stone upon another, which will not be torn down. Now, every time I've gone to the widow of 2 mites, I've always gone to say, see there, you should be willing to give everything that you have in the collection plate. But look what his message really is in verse 6. If you read what she put in there, then you read the next verse, what is he saying? She's putting her money into a building that's going to be torn down and not even be here, within a generation's time. What he's showing is the fallacy of their super focused dedication to the temple instead of God. If they had read the law, the Old Testament, then what they would have found is a different type of attitude. Look at Matthew chapter 12, and we'll see that. In Matthew 12 and verse 1, notice what happens. He says, "At that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the head of the grain and eat. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples do not what is lawful.'" We would say, not do what is scriptural, is the way that we would. He's unscriptural, right? He's in error. You have to leave out the O's and just go, right? When you say that. "Look, your disciples are in error," or "your disciples are unscriptural. They're doing things you're not supposed to do on the Sabbath." But he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions, how he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful," or not scriptural, "for them to eat, or for those with him, but for the priests alone? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here." Jesus' whole thing is, y'all's hyper focus on this temple is misplaced. You're willing to give all of your possessions to it, your very last 2 mites, which you need to live off of. You're willing to give those to that, and it's going to fall here shortly. You're putting so much emphasis on this place and following the law so strictly that you've missed the spirit of the law, what it all is pointing to, the purpose of it. The purpose of giving on the first day of the week in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2 wasn't so that you could check off a checklist and pat yourself on the back and said, "Good, I gave my tithe on the first day of the week." But it was to help out the needy saints in Jerusalem. There was a purpose behind it. The purpose behind attending worship service isn't so you can go, "Hey, good job, I've attended worship service on Sunday, and I even went to that pesky Wednesday night Bible class that comes right on, during the middle of Friends," or whatever, So it's not for that. Why do you go to Wednesday night Bible study? Why do you attend Sunday morning worship? Why do you do anything that you do? It's because of your love for God. It's because of your love for the fellowship that we've built here, the family that we've built here, and you just want to study the Bible. That's what it's from. It's not just to check off a list. That's misplaced. That's doing what the widow with 2 mites did. She put in her last 2 mites, but why'd she? She didn't understand she did not understand the spirit of the law. As he says here in verse 7, "But if you had known what this means, 'I desire compassion and not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent." God did not need those sacrifices to be offered up. God's not up there looking at him, saying, "I really need you to give me this sacrifice or I'm just going to be so mad." No, the point of the sacrifice was for them to be able to have a way to express themselves to God. It's a way for them to get closure themselves and to, have something to do, right? It's a personification of their forgiveness. What he really desired is compassion, is mercy, is grace. And making a widow feel morally obligated to put in everything that you possess, everything that she possesses into the collection plate is not mercy and grace. That's an emphasis on the procedure, not on the spirit behind the procedure. You see what I'm getting at? A lot of times in the church, we get caught up on the action and not what the action points to. Let me do this. Very good. I get to go to heaven today if I die. No, that's not what it's for. It's not so you can feel good about yourself checking off a list, saying that you did what you're supposed to do and took the Lord's Supper. It's so that you can remember the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus and go throughout this next week with your mind focused on what Christ's done for us. It's not about checking off a list or patting yourself on the back. It's not about the temple. It's about what it all points to, a relationship with God. Now let's go back to John chapter 2 just for a moment, and then we'll be done. In John chapter 2, we read this in verse 18 about what Jesus had done. The Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us as your authority for doing these things?" In other words, who gives you the right to do what you've done here and drive us out of the temple? And Jesus said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews then said, it took 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Jesus isn't, he's talking about the temple there, but he's not. He's basically saying, with my death and resurrection, we're going to have a shift from this place to a new type of temple. A temple that doesn't demand widows to give their last 2 mites. A temple that doesn't demand people to pay all this money to get these sacrifices so that they can feel, right in the sight of God. It's not a place that demands that people leave their ox in a ditch on a Saturday. It's not a place that demands that people get fired from their job so they can attend a Sunday morning worship service and check off 5 things off the list so they can go to heaven. It's not that type of temple. It's a new type of temple, a new type of creation that is focused on grace and mercy and peace, where Jesus has done the work for you to get into heaven. All you have to do is obey the gospel and accept it. That's what he says in Romans chapter 8, that Christ has fulfilled the righteous requirement of the law for us or on our behalf. I always say it's the last passage, and I know we talked about how you should never believe me when I say that, so I'm just going to give this to you as a compromise. I'm not going to make you go there. I'm just going to remind you of it. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen, the first Christian martyr, quotes from Isaiah chapter 66. And basically what he says is, do you really think that God is limited to living in a house that was made with our hands? Do you really think that he's limited to living in this little bitty box that you have him in Jerusalem? No, God is everywhere. And wherever the church is, God is present within it. If you have to work on Sunday to support your family, and that's what you have to do, then God is right there with you. Because where you are, God is. His Son and he and the Spirit dwell in us and among us. That type of mentality, that temple type of mentality is gone. There's a new way that we live now. And we have to be sure that we're not doing what they did, or we've made this new way into a den of thieves as well, where we oppress and hurt people and do the same types of things that they were doing there. I'm not going to get into that anymore. Let's see. I think Jaden, is that all the verses I told you I was going to go? Is that all the verses? Okay. Got them all? All right, good. Jaden, he has to keep me in line because somebody's got to, and Laura's not here, so he's got to do that for me. All right. Every single Sunday, we offer